Okay, everybody, let's go ahead and get started with our program. I have a few announcements first. I'd like to acknowledge the passing of Sally Merrill. She was very active in the Native Plant Project and in many other nature organizations throughout the valley. So we want to acknowledge her as a good friend to nature and to the ecology. Also, just check out after the program, we still have a lot of native plants for a generous donation. And we have our handbook out available for sale. Also, Ken has brought some of the book Plants of Deep South Texas for sale. If you need to pay your dues, you can see Bert Wessling after the meeting. If you want to become a new member, he's our treasurer and he can help you with that as well. Also, there's going to be a program at Quinta Mazatlan on April 13th on container gardening. You might be interested. It's container gardening with natives, and I'm going to be presenting that there. So it should be fun. It is from 6 to 7 p.m. April 13th. It's a Thursday. It's part of the Quinta's Nature Speaker Series that they have on Thursday evenings. So I'd love to see y'all out there if you're interested. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. This is Michael, and he is gonna talk with us tonight about what he does at the San Antonio Botanical Garden, Michael Eason. And he's been involved with the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. He's also been involved with the Native Plant Society of Texas. And he's been our speaker before, and we've really enjoyed having him. He's also the author of Wildflowers of Texas that was published in 2018. So with that, I'd like to introduce Michael Eason.
There we go. So yeah, I worked at the Wildflower Center for about a decade. And during that time, that was when I first started coming down here in like maybe 2006 or so, doing some collecting for the Millennium Seed Bank Project. And then kind of off and on, I guess till about 2010. And then that's when I moved out to West Texas, and there was kind of a delay, I guess, for a while before I started coming back down again. And that was probably a few years later. But now I'm in San Antonio. I was in Alpine for about 10 years. So I'm at San Antonio Botanical Garden. I run their rare plant conservation programs there. I've actually been there for about 5 years, but for about actually almost 6, I think, at this point. But the first 5 was part-time, very part-time. And I work remotely out of Alpine. So I just come down here about 3 or 4 times a year, checking on our CPC species, which I'll get to here in a little bit. But I like to go through and give kind of a review of Texas and our flora and kind of what we're going to be talking about. So as you can see on that little slide, that's what we'll be discussing. And one of the big things I like to be clear on is what is plant conservation? How's that different from preservation? Then we'll talk about the various plant programs we have at San Antonio, and then why are we conserving these plants and habitats, and then a few other hopefully humorous things at the end. We'll see. So how many plants do we have here in Texas? Answers on the screen, class. About 5,800, roughly. How many ecoregions? 12, good. Open book. So yeah, we have a lot of plants here. Out of those 5,800, we have about 450 classified as rare, and that's through TPWD. In 2017, that's when that number went up to about 450. Before that, we had about 220, so it more than doubled. Many of these plants, they were on sort of a watch list for a very long time, and then I think in 2017, they just made it official. There's some plants on there that I don't agree with, but there's some plants that they left off, in my opinion, that should be classified as rare. And out of that 5,800, about 10% or 600 species are introduced. That number might seem a little, or is actually a little inflated, because if you look at some of the collections of some of the introduced species to Texas, it might be 1 or 2 collections from someone's garden or some city someplace, and it's never really escaped. So that number is actually a little bit lower for true sort of escaped or naturalized species. How large is Texas? So yeah, so 171 million acres, 162 is basically privately owned. Out of that, we have 77%, or 132 million acres is classified as ag land. And what is ag land? So when you hear agriculture, what do you think? Farming. So yes, so crops. So you think of cotton, onions, peppers, and go on for like melons and all the other stuff. But what most people don't associate with ag land is pasture land or range land. And when you're driving through Texas and you look out on those beautiful landscapes, the vast majority of that's private rangeland. It's not, it's classified as ag land, it's not cropland, but people don't necessarily put that together. How many people moved here in 2021? That's a lot. So 30 million people currently, roughly. And so all of that's putting increased pressure on our natural areas and public and private lands. Who's been to Big Bend lately? 500,000 people a year in Big Bend now. Yeah, so that just a few years ago, it was about 350 to 400,000. So it's really increased over the past few years. And because of all those people moving, everything that we've done here, generations of cattle, goats, sheep, farming, growth, et cetera, our landscapes have changed. I took this photo up in a little town called Natalia, where I was doing a little pipeline survey. And I used to call these areas sort of feral landscapes, feral urban landscapes. They didn't really fit with anything that we had in our habitat association, because it was such a mix of species. And if you go through, you can see, I think that's a, nope, I don't know what I just did. But if you look on there, we have Chinaberry, that's Melia, Baccharis, Facelia, sorghum. So a mix of native and non-native species, and many of those native species are what we would call sort of pioneer species, or species that like to be around disturbed areas, or you find them in disturbed areas. Recently, I came across this term, which really fits it well. There's actually a term for animals. So synanthropic animals would be things like raccoons, coyotes, animals that have adapted to living with humans. And so I just kind of applied that to these plants. So synanthropic plants, they've sort of adapted to living with those. They like that disturbance. And if you go around some of these smaller towns, or if you get into a larger city or metropolitan area and you find a natural area, it's not going to be pristine. It's not going to be anything close to pristine. You're going to have loads of non-native invasive species in there. You're going to have a system that's just, our habitat system that just is not working at all. One of the things that I've done in the past is survey various city parks throughout Texas and give them a recommendation on what they need to do. And oftentimes it's like you're removing invasive species. That's one thing. But then what about all those native plants that are there? They also have to be decreased if you're going to try to create something a little bit more natural. In some cases, you can walk through a forest of cedar elms, and they'll all be about 4 inches in diameter, and there'll be thousands of them. And what does that tell you? Like, whatever was going on there before, which is probably cattle ranching, stopped, and then these seedlings just sprouted and took off. And so now it's basically a monoculture of a native plant. So we're looking at those things. So back to people and what we're doing here. So 650 acres per day here in the state of Texas are being developed. Sounds like a lot? Yeah. How much do you think is down here in the valley? Probably more than that. Half of that is low density, so that'd be residential areas. The other half is high density, so more urban areas. So strip malls, urban centers, things like that. So all of that comes into, or plays into, the decreasing in the plant populations, and thus the genetics that we find in those populations, habitat systems and fragmentation, and of course, biodiversity. So we have this loss of all of those things with this continual growth that we're doing. And most of that property that's being developed is that either farmland or ranch land. And surprisingly enough, there's another group out there that's trying to preserve the farmland and ranch land. That, how do you put it, the ranching history of Texas. So we're trying to preserve that. There's some groups out there that are definitely actively doing that. One gentleman I talked to he was telling me the decrease in cattle ranching. So we're having fewer cows being raised for beef here in the state of Texas because many more landowners are purchasing land and they're opting not to run cattle on them. They're just buying land to have land. One of those folks might own Amazon. This is basically what I like to state to people when we start talking about these things. Because when I have worked on properties in the past, like city parks, things like that, they talk about restoring these areas. There's no restoring. We're never going to go back to what was once here before the Europeans showed up. It ain't going to happen. There's just too much stuff to deal with at this point. So that's 650 acres per year. So who has been to Big Bend National Park? Right. So roughly about 40,000 acres. I think it's a bit more now. They added some. But that's a list of basically everything I came across that can be found in the park. So return 4 years later, and if you lost Big Bend National Park, that might have an impact. But I think most people just see those small 2 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres, 50 acres here or there, and they don't really piece that together across the state of Texas. And they think, oh yeah, we've lost that, we've lost this, we've lost this. But if something major, if you compiled all that together over the course of 3.5 years and we lost Big Bend, I think people might be a little bit more apt to make some changes in the things that we're doing here. A few other examples. I've often heard mesquite's always been here. This is an overgrazed blackland prairie. It did not look like this. This is just south of Hayes County. You might recognize this. When I worked for the Seed Bank Project, we collected seeds on that site. So those genetics are gone. And as my friend Hovind Riley would say, you can't put that back. They're just gone, everything there. The species, you can still find those elsewhere in the area, but those genetics that were found in that one population, no more. Dan Hosage, a friend of mine, y'all might know his name. He used to run Madrone Nursery, recently closed it down. He was doing this for 30 plus years, and for the past 5 to 7 years, he's been telling me that many of the populations he would go to collect seeds for his nursery, they're just being obliterated, whether that's roadside widening or apartment buildings going in, et cetera, et cetera. And he's been telling me this for a long time. It took me a while for it to click. Another one, this is just up the road here in the Coastal Bend. Anyone see anything wrong with that photo? Yeah. So Riviera, if you're familiar with that. So just up 77. This photo was taken, I believe, right there. So these are our coastal wetlands, and they've basically been turned to ag land, whether that's farming or ranching. And at times, these areas just flood, and this just does not make sense to me at all. Another one, this is Alice, Texas. This is guinea grass, buffalo grass, Bermuda grass are the 3 dominant grasses there. Very few other species, and then a mix of mesquite and elm, I believe, that was there, China berry, but that's not normal. Hill country, I love this one. This is outside of Rock Springs. Typically supposed to be a live oak juniper habitat. Open grasslands, meadows. Do you see any of that in this photo? Anybody know what caused that? Overgrazing, Angora goats. There was a $100 million subsidy up until the mid-90s. These are some quotes I found whenever they were trying to get rid of that, or they did get rid of that subsidy. If you can read through those quickly. My favorite's the last one. And that's the mentality sometimes that we're dealing with. You say that again? Right. It's this idea that the land is worthless unless we're making money off of it or if it's providing something to us. And so I'm dealing with that quite a bit. Extinctions. Do you know that we have plant extinctions here in Texas? 7 of 9. We found the Quercus tardifolia last year, and somebody may have found the dahlia. We don't know that for sure yet, but there were some rumblings about that. So conservation versus preservation. Which one of these groups does preservation? Well, think about food, right? You're on a life raft. You got 20 sandwiches. You're going to eat them all the first day? No. So you're going to dole those out over as long as you think you're going to be on that life raft. That's conservation. Preservation, figs, jellies, you're preserving those. So the answer is kind of a trick question. None of these are preservation, but those are the two that come closest to it. All those other ones, fish and wildlife, et cetera, think about hunting, fishing, logging, mining, et cetera, with BLM. The only two there that don't allow hunting that I know of would be conservants or the Katy Prairie and the National Park Service. But like I said, 500,000 people per year going to Big Bend National Park is going to have an impact. I'd love to sit there and show you photos of all the tissue paper and toilet paper and trash and plastic bottles that you see along the trails or behind the rock that someone thinks, oh, no one's ever going to see this. Or in the spring down below the window that just happened to drop in the waterfall and make its way down because no one ever goes down there except for people like me looking for plants. And you see a collection of plastic bottles at the base of the waterfall. So yeah, we are having an impact out there. People are poaching from Big Bend National Park. In fact, there was a plant that was recently found there about a year or two ago. There were 2 of them, and they were close to a road. One of them was a cactus. One of them disappeared. And then about a month later, the other one disappeared. You can see the hole that was left. I didn't get a chance to go down there and see it. One of the volunteers told me about it. So it's actively happening. So the only way to truly call that a preserve is if we just took people off that and didn't allow anybody to go back. So out of that, 5% of the land is publicly owned. Out of that 5%, 0.5% is national park land. That's really, really low. So that leaves 95% plus or minus land with really no protection. And so that's where these conservation projects come in. And so the big one for us would be the rare plant conservation and CPC, which I'll talk about in a second. So these rare plants, 450 species plus or minus, 24 endangered. That number just went up. You know why? Yeah, just listed at the end of February. 8 threatened, 10 state listed, at least 400 at-risk species without any sort of federal or state protection. And then 400 or 4,800 plus or minus common plants that don't really have any protection whatsoever. There's all these things we have to sort of balance when we're working on things. So one of these things that we're working on is orchid conservation. So we have 54 species here in Texas. Many of those are hetero or microheterotrophs. So those are plants that are feeding off fungi that are feeding off the plant. So I don't think the Hexalectris warnocki is one of those. Those are generally like the red stemmed ones or yellow stemmed ones, plants without any chlorophyll. But things like the Cypripedium, Dichromanthus, which is rare in Texas but not rare elsewhere, and the Malaxis, which is rare in Texas, Big Bend National Park. Cypripedium, are y'all familiar with this yellow lady slipper orchid? Used to be pretty widespread in Texas. When you look at the map and you look at all the little different like counties that are highlighted where it's found, it's like, oh, well, it's pretty widespread out there. And there's lots of little populations, you would think. Many of those are just one plant. And so what's it going to breed with if there's just one plant? So you have to think about that. So that some of these plants are that term sort of ecologically extinct. So they're still existing in the wild, but they're not really providing any benefit to the ecology there. So a few years ago, my friend Adam Black was driving around collecting pollen from these different populations and then doing some cross-pollination, and we were getting we're getting seed production, and it was close to 100%. And it's an amazing thing that he was doing. But I think back, it's like, well, we knew that this plant was rare 20 years ago. Why are we waiting till like the very last moment to try to save it? Some of these plants are on forest land. They are heavily protected. They're not going to allow any logging in these areas. In one case, one of the populations we went to, it wasn't hard to find because there was a social trail leading straight to it. I can say the same thing in Big Bend National Park. There's some very, very rare plants out there, and now you would have to know which turn or which bend in that trail to take to get to that rare plant population or that one rare plant. And now you can see it. It's just a social trail that leads right to it. So that information is getting out. So while I haven't seen any poaching of some of these plants, just the ecological damage, that micro habitat damage that's going on around it is probably going to end up affecting it. Aquatics of Texas, this is a fun one. Mainly focusing on Western Texas. So we've been redocumenting some of the aquatics out in West Texas, many of these ephemeral aquatics. Documenting new populations, making seed collections, bringing that back to Central Texas. There's a guy named Casey Williams who would be great to have down here as a presenter to talk about the work that he does. This is one that there's just a handful of collections listed in the herbarium records, but as we got out to this one ranch, this one, the 06 ranch, just about every pond we went to, we found some. So these are plants that are dispersed by birds, or seeds are dispersed by birds. And so every little sort of drainage we would go to, we'd find a new population of these guys. So there's a lot more out there. If you look at the records, it might only show just a handful of collections, but the reality of the situation is just getting beyond those fence lines onto some of this private land and documenting this stuff. Through this, and this is the drainage that's close to the ranch house. I was out one day and I found this plant and I didn't recognize it. Took some collected it, took some photos of it, sent it to Casey, and he goes, "Oh, that's ceratophyllum." I was like, "Sure, it doesn't look like the ceratophyllum I'm used to seeing in Central Texas." And he's like, "No, that's what it looks like." He goes, "Sometimes they'll look a little different in heavy shaded areas." Like, okay. They came back about a month later, made a collection, sent it off for DNA, new species. So no telling what you're going to find out there. Here's another, we call that dog tank, and that's on that property. But in this one area, I think we had about half a dozen aquatic plants that we were able to document from this new location. So it's a fun one. This is what a typical lower elevation wetland looks like. This is out by Balmorhea. This is probably what Balmorhea State Park, the springs there, probably looked like well before we got involved. Just really a swamp. Really cool plants we're finding there. Obviously, this one's pretty widespread. I'm sure you know the bluebells. But what about that Flavaria? Are you all familiar with that one down in the middle? That was a fun one. We're actually growing it now. Flavaria chlorofolia. It was first collected by Charles Perry at Comanche Springs. Does that sound familiar? Fort Stockton. Went dry. So the aquifer was pumped so low that basically that spring went dry. I mean, intermittently it would release water, but functionally it was just not a wetland anymore. It's found in the Pecos River drainage. It's rare in Texas. But the cool thing about it is that its flavus is yellow, chlorofolia, green leaves. So we'll put that together, what do you have? It's the yellow flowering plant with green leaves. So next time somebody asked you if you can ID that plant, and then you say, what does it look like? And they said it has yellow flower and green leaves. It has to be that one. Yeah. Yeah. So we're actually, I did a seed collection of this. My friend Martin Simonton grew it out. So we're going to take this back to some restored wetlands that a landowner she bought some old farmland and has been restoring this back to wetland status. So I think we have about 300 4-inch plants we're going to be planting early April. And then ideally what we'll end up doing is harvesting from that. And then she also has property around Balmorhea Lake. And then she's flooding that as well. So we'll start adding some of these plants back to her areas over there. All right, Center for Plant Conservation. This is our longest program. So San Antonio Botanical Garden was established in '84. We joined in '85, the Center for Plant Conservation. We were the first institution in Texas to join. You probably heard the name Paul Cox, right? Maybe somebody here has. He was sort of the leader up in that Central Texas area and acquiring lots of plants. He collected a lot of plants down here in South Texas and brought them up for the South Texas Trail, and we have the East Texas Trail, et cetera, et cetera. Originally, we were focused on Central Texas. That was our main focus. And then the Wildflower Center came on in the late 90s and things shifted, and we sort of went down to South Texas. And then I kind of came on board, and I was like, well, it doesn't make any sense if I'm driving across the state that I should just focus on South Texas plants. So I started doing lots of collections, rare plants for CPC throughout western Central Texas and out into West Texas. And originally we started off with about 13 species, and now we're up to 22 that are officially under CPC. So that's, if you look at the list on their website, you'll see 22 species for San Antonio, but we have well over 50 now in our collection. Some of that seed that we've collected, some of those are seeds that we've collected and grown out. So we have live plants in our collection. Some of these are live plants that other collectors or growers have grown, and we're able to get those for our collection. But over 50, and that number keeps changing every few months, it seems like. And then recently we were able to, I figured out the back button, expand our rare plant garden. So it used to be quite small. Now we've more than tripled in size. I don't have a photo of it yet, but here's a handful of our plants. You might recognize some of those, Justicia. Pensman, that's from West Texas. There's the Asclepias prostrata and Yitzia. So the Asclepias prostrata is by far, I think, over the past few years, our biggest sort of success story. A few years ago, I'm not sure if you saw those photos, but I just happened to come across some tarantula hawks sort of working the flowers, and sent them to Chris Best and said, hey, I've got some photos of the tarantula hawk on the Asclepias. He goes, oh, that's great. It's like, man, it'd be so cool if you actually had pollinia on the legs. So I went through about 500 photos, and you got to like zoom in, zoom out. Next photo. It actually had pollinia on some of the legs of some of these tarantula hawks. So they were pretty excited about that. And this other guy over here just showing the tubers that are formed, and that's in a quart pot. So last year, I brought down a bunch of seed, and through Ken, we passed this along to James Lovegren, and he grew out about 100 seedlings for us. Ended up taking those up to, or the bulk of those back to San Antonio, and put them in some other pots. We grew those out. And last week, or 2 weeks ago, I was at the Budding Out Festival for John Ferry Garden, and I brought a handful of these Asclepias just to show people our rare plants that we're working on, and a bunch of other plants as well. And I wanted to show them the root production that we had within, it was, I think, 8 months or 9 months for these Asclepias that we had in pots. I flipped that thing over, and it had tubers already forming. So it's a plant that's less than a year old that's forming those tubers. And the tubers are about the size of my thumb. So I was like, wow, this is amazing. So not only are we able to get this plant propagated, get mature plants growing, it hasn't flowered yet, but now we have tubers that eventually we should be able to divide those up and then increase our numbers that way, sort of vegetatively and through seed collection. So that's a good one. And I just picked up a whole bunch more today. We'll see what happens soon. One of our conservation collections will be this Fabiaceae. It's really the woody Fabiaceae of Texas and sort of northern Mexico. We've gone through several options before we got to this one. This one seemed to make the most sense. It was in direct competition with this guy. So this is going to be our secondary collection, the Apocynaceae of essentially Texas Southwest and maybe northern Mexico if we can get some plants. These two guys were just photographed 2 days ago, right down the road on my way in. It was a kind of a highlight. for me. The Texas Seed Bank Project. So this goes back to my time at the Wildflower Center. Even after I left the Wildflower Center, I kept collecting seeds for people and passing those off to nurseries or to the Wildflower Center or to whoever really wanted it. And so for us, doing seed collection has many benefits. We're going to use them for basically our gardens. We use them for conservation. We'll use them for our plant sales. And with the hope, and this is coming from my landscape side where I design and install landscapes, is that some of these plants will get into the nursery trade because we are vastly, vastly underrepresented in native plants in the nursery trade here in Texas. All right, and then another one, oaks of the Southwest. Have y'all heard about these? What time do I have? Oaks of the Southwest. So I actually got wrangled into this about 2.5 years ago through a friend of mine. He goes, hey, I would like you to join the GCCO, which is the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak. I was like, okay, well, what do I have to do? He goes, well, you're already doing it. You're already going out scouting some of these plants for us, and it's really getting San Antonio involved. Like, okay, well, as long as there's not too much of a commitment, we'll be good. So this was very enlightening to me, mainly because I knew about oaks. We never really focused on those when I was at the Wildflower Center because they are recalcitrant and we were looking at the orthodox seed to collect. We just kind of bypassed all the oaks. But West Texas is an oak diversity hotspot. I think we have 26 species in West Texas, which is pretty crazy when you think about it's about half of what you find in Texas can be found in West Texas. And when you look at the evolutionary history of oaks and see what happened with them, so they were radiating out of Mexico, and the coastal plants of Mexico kind of went up into the East Coast, and then you had the western coast of Mexico kind of go up to the West Coast, and you had all this crazy stuff happening in West Texas and sort of northern central Mexico. With these oaks are still trying to figure it out. Like if you go to Europe and look at the oaks, you're pretty sure like, oh yeah, these are all pretty stable. They're still highly, highly variable in West Texas. And so when I would do field work, I would often say, these are mostly Gravesii or these are mostly Emeryii. And that's where we would just leave it because we didn't have time to sort of battle it out there in the field, and we just kind of went our own way. So that's a Gravesii down there. But just to show you some of the diversity. So this guy down here in the bottom corner, that was a new population that we found on some private land. The Quercus hinklei, that was probably the first acorn collection in well over a decade from private land in West Texas. We found a couple of what seems to be new population of Bracilliformis, which is the slender leaf oak. Then of course we started talking about this tardifolia that was lost. No one knew where it was. So we went out and started finding some other strange things. So here's a Quercus robusta, which that may be a hybrid. We don't know. That's just a common Grisea. But these three oaks on that side, that lobata is actually a white oak, which will probably end up being, that bottom left corner is a white oak that will probably end up being a new species. It was just generally listed as lobata, which is apparently wrong, according to the oak experts. But these two here in the middle, these are some things that we found in Big Bend National Park and then on the Livermore Ranch. And this guy matches nothing that we know. And there's some genetic work that was done and it's sort of trying to figure it out. But the crazy thing about that plant, it has these sort of arachnoid hairs on the underside of the leaves, which matches nothing in Big Bend National Park. No other plant has that white underside like that. We're like, well, if tardifolia ends up being a hybrid, what are the parent species if there's nothing with whiteness on the underside? So tardifolia. So just to give you some background, 1930s, that's when it was named by Mueller. It was at Boot Spring in Big Bend National Park. Apparently he was riding his horse up there, stopped for lunch, looked up, oh, this is weird. And apparently that plant was around for quite a while. There are numerous reports of it from 1980s, early 2000s of various botanists going up there, looking at it, pretty close to Boot Springs. People would make treks up there to find it, and they all went to the same spot. No one really looked for any more in the area. Just to give you an idea, this is the cabin that we stayed in. Yeah, that's the cabin. And then just about right in there is where Boot Spring is. So that's a lot of land to cover if you're just looking for this one oak. So people really weren't looking for it. I mean, we knew about the one there, and then 2011-ish, we're guessing. This is Boot Cabin or Boot Canyon and Juniper Canyon from a different area. That's the spire. So the other photo was taken in that canyon. So this is Lower Boot that comes down. And it's one of the areas we searched. So in 2011, the tree just disappeared. And this was, someone please say aliens. It was like a 30-foot tree, multi-trunked. I just saw some recent photos of it, absolutely beautiful. And somehow it was just gone. So nobody knows what happened. There wasn't a fire, there wasn't a flood, it's just gone. Yeah, we don't know. And I was working there in 2011. I was asked by Betty Alex, who was one of the park botanists at the time. She asked me to check on it, and I couldn't find it. And I was there in August of 2011, spent 3 weeks up there, did not see it. So in 2021, and this is when I started getting involved, we go out there in September. We do this big trek to basically collect DNA work. We collected something like 150 voucher specimens for DNA work. And while we're there, it's like, we discussed this, like no one's actually systematically looked for this tree or this species here. And then some people said, well, you know, I've looked for it and so-and-so's looked for it and so-and-so's, but did you have a team of 8 people out here systematically looking in the places where it should be found? And at that point, that kind of put the bug in the ear of some people that were going to end up funding this project. And we go back in May of 2022, and well, we found it. So not too far from where that cabin is. This is a different tree. And you can see it from the trail, which is amazing. So it looked like hell at that point. You can see it's like the yellow leaves, et cetera. Probably droughts. There's some drought issues going on, probably some fungal issues going on. But this is the team of folks that was all up there looking for it. And so that was what you didn't read is that's the 3rd tree we found. So upstream, we found another one that was smaller. We weren't really sure of calling that tardifolia. And the other one I showed you earlier with that white underside, that was the first one we found. So we've actually found 3. So to me, that indicates that there's a lot more out there. And then as it turns out, there is a lot more out there. So this year we went out and we collected scions from all the different trees. Those went up to Ryan Russell, and I believe he's in Missouri, and he's growing these guys out now. So we have buds coming out. We have basically all the plants in Big Bend National Park that we called tardifolia, even if they may not come back to be tardifolia. And then a handful of other trees that we found on some private land in Davis Mountains, including this one, which is by far the most convincing tardifolia-like tree that we have found outside of Big Bend National Park. And the crazy thing is, so we did this in January. One of the things we noticed is all the things that we're calling tardifolia are evergreen. All the Gravesii have dropped all their leaves. These are evergreen trees. So when we go back, when's the best time to go? January. So you just look for trees that have green leaves. There you go. So all those scions, we collected several hundred of them in total, but they'll end up going out to the various GCCO organizations. So San Antonio, probably the Wildflower Center, probably Denver Botanic Garden, Bartlett Tree Research, Mobot, Morton, US Botanic Garden. So there's a lot of players involved there. These are the leaves. These are the undersides of the leaves of that tree. And that was actually found by Kelsey Logan. She works at Sol Ross. Grad student there. So why do we conserve plants? Anybody want to answer that question? So I used to, when I first started doing this 20 plus years ago, I used to have to sort of scramble for a reason when people would ask me, like, why, like, why are we doing this? Like, what is the purpose of saving habitats and saving plants? Why are we doing this? And then I'm starting to get maybe a little bitter and then coming up with other answers. So, and these are things that we may not understand what their relationship is in the wild. We just need to be doing the right thing. And the other one is, what is it good for? Who's heard that one? So again, you have to scramble. So it's medicinal. And a lot of times we're looking at like for human use. And that's from Leopold. Who's heard of the book Under a Green Sky? Highly recommend it. It's a story of how it's a collection of essays essentially, but as we have humans, we like to screw things up and then we like to come in and fix them. And then sometimes like the ways that we fix them just doesn't make any sense. Like we're doing what in order to prevent X from happening? And one of the ones was the pupfish in Death Valley. If you're familiar with that, it's known from like one pool, and they recreated basically in a building away from the spring, the exact spring, and they recreated it to where like when the sun is at a certain aspect in January, it's going to mimic it inside this building. So the pupfish, they basically just think that they're back home. And if you've ever seen any of those Star Trek episodes where they just take a whole like community and stick them in a simulator somewhere and they think that they're somewhere, but they're not, they're in a spaceship. That's what it reminded me of. But there was a biologist in there that she interviewed, and he kept getting asked that question, like, what is the pupfish good for? And his answer was, and I'm almost to that point when people ask. There was a guy up in Live Oak County, and I pulled over to check on the sessile penny up there, and someone had just recently mowed this thing to about 4 inches tall. And I'm just sitting there in utter like defeat. And he pulls up in his Jeep and asks me, hey, what are you doing? Are you here to finish like mowing the yard or whatever? I'm like, no. And it's his, it's his property. And I was like, this is not your property. This is county property. Your property stops at the fence line. He goes, oh, I'm just trying to keep it tidy. So the only known accessible population at this point, he just keeps trimming it back and back and back. But luckily we are growing that. So what are we doing? Education is one of the big things that we're doing. Promotion of those atypical plants. So that's through my collections that I do, or I purchase plants from other people. We bring them up to San Antonio. We try to increase those numbers. We try to get those out to the public. I try to share the seeds, the plant material with other nurseries that I'm connected with so they can grow them and get them out there. We're collecting species with provenance, which is a huge, huge, huge thing for us. Most of the plants at San Antonio currently don't have provenance. We've lost a lot of our data. So we're rebuilding that. Why is provenance important? Anybody want to answer that question? Why is it good to know where the plants come from? That, but if we have to do a reintroduction or an augmentation, it's good to know that we're bringing plants of this population back to that population. Some plants are found throughout the state of Texas. So if we want to promote native plants and you want to grow something that's found throughout the state of Texas, it'd be best to collect it in the valley, sell it to the people in the valley. If it's going to be in the Panhandle, collect it up there, sell it to those people. In many cases, on some of those projects I worked on in the past with those city parks, county parks, they're requiring plants not only to be native within 100, 150 miles of the park, but they want the genetics to come from 100, 150 miles from that park. So they have the most localized genetics as possible. So we're collecting seed plant material, as I mentioned, and collaboration and networking. While I remained in contact with a select few people after I left the Wildflower Center, the network that I had developed when I was there was not just statewide. It was nationwide and in some cases international. Luckily, I didn't go too far away. So I'm able to reconnect with a lot of those folks, a lot of those landowners, to get them back involved. What can y'all do? Diversity in gardens. That's a big thing. Highly diverse gardens. I often hear people talk about, let's say, penstemons, for instance. They say, well, those penstemons are short bloom. They only bloom for about, 3 weeks to a month and they're done. It's like, well, then plant 5 different species of penstemons. So that way, or at least we can do that in West Texas. And so I have something that starts blooming now and will bloom all the way through basically September. They're different species, but they just overlap. Atypical natives. We just collected, or I collected a salvia out in West Texas, or let me rephrase that. We purchased some salvia that somebody else collected. We brought that to our gardens. This is not a rare plant. Should be, because it's only from one county in Texas. We put some in our garden. It did amazingly well at San Antonio. So we started growing it from cuttings. And so, wow, this is pretty easy to grow. So now we've got about 200, I think, that we'll probably be selling over the next few plant sales. That's good and bad. Good thing is we can definitely grow it. Bad thing is it's only coming from 3 different plants. So we really need to go back and do seed collection where we get more diverse genetics. Seed plant material collection. That's, anyone that has property, if you're out collecting, provide that to some local growers. I know that you guys do a lot down here. I mean, it's actually a lot better down here than other places. But some of the other places I go to, people have no idea how to go about collecting seed and who to get that to grow it. And there's a guy up in Dallas, for instance, that's growing in his backyard in the middle of suburbia. And he's, has 200 or 300 different species that he's growing in this really tiny backyard. And he's providing that to the NPSOT chapters, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, down here, trust me, you're fortunate. And of course, support those independent nurseries and growers. I think a lot of people forget. Sometimes they just oh, we're just going to do the native plant sales. But then we were just talking about there's a new nursery opening up in San Antonio called the Nectar Bar, which is going to be all native plants and hard to find native plants. My friend Martin just opened up his retail side, same thing. There's a third person in New Braunfels that's opening up one in April. He'll be purchasing from other people. He's not a grower. But you can see that tide changing. There's more and more people. And I've always told folks this, when I talk to various larger nurseries, it's well, there's just not a demand for those plants. No, whenever I do a landscape install in the West Texas, people want to know, where am I getting these plants? They want to know, who am I buying these plants from? Because they don't want to go to Home Depot or Lowe's and just pick out the same typical plants. Or if you don't want to do that, you can do nothing. And if you can't tell, that's fake grass. That right there is a sedge. So it crept in right on the edge. This one over here, that middle photo, is just a new development that went out outside of San Antonio. And I had to take a photo of it. It's just 5 species plus the grass, whatever that is. And it's repeated from house to house to house to house to house. And then, of course, it's this live oak, which is probably from Florida. And then the other tag that I didn't show on there is these trees or these plants are treated with pesticides, be careful handling, blah, 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 all this other stuff. So, the other side of this is that oftentimes when people are buying from these larger nurseries or big box stores, the plants that you're buying for pollinators are treated with pesticides that end up killing the pollinators you're trying to attract. It's I don't know what we're doing. So anyway, thanks for coming out, and I'll field questions, and we got that done in just under an hour. Are we doing anything to work with legislatures or city governments, et cetera, to pass laws to sort of make it a requirement to use native plants? There are communities that require native plants. So I think Austin might be one of them. There are developers that when during the master planning of a development, they require certain native plants. And if I went back to one of those other photos, those are native plants. So that tree, that Quercus virginiana, yeah, it's native and it says Texas live oak on it, but the genetics are coming out of Florida. If you live in Houston, that's probably okay. If you live down here, nah, I wouldn't want to introduce the Florida genetics here, but it happens all the time. I know that NIPSOT, the Native Plant Society of Texas, they're heavily involved now in trying to make those changes, but really it's up to y'all and us and me as individual people to try to make that change. Whether it's if you live in the community and you're going to redo the front plantings at the entrance of your community, get involved. Let's put in native plants. If there's a local city park, get involved, plant native plants. And that's probably going to be one of the best things to do. Make your voice heard, locally. And that you don't necessarily have to change city ordinances to do that, but you can get involved with local politics to make some of those changes. I think that the city of Austin with Zolker Park are trying to redo that park and enhance it, make it better. I think that they're trying to do the right thing. When I first started working on that project, I would hear the term, "Oh, it's been loved to death." Oh, it's been loved to death. It's, da 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 da. You go through there, and as I was walking through, it's like, nah, it wasn't being loved to death. It was lack of maintenance, attention. There was just apathy, essentially, within the city parks department. I mean, when you look at the erosion of the trails and how bad they were, it's obvious this didn't just happen last week. This has been going on for years. And so I know that they came out with a proposed master plan or proposed plan for that park recently. And in some cases, or in some people, it wasn't taken in completely. I was like, they weren't really happy with the outcome. I do know that they're trying to add that diversity into that park and bring it back to, it is sort of the crown jewel of Austin, and it really should be. But it's when it's being used for Austin City Limits Festival and who knows what else goes on, it has such a hundreds of thousands of people coming to that park on some of those events. It's just having a negative impact on it. Yeah, so I've only seen it down here in South Texas once. The largest populations I've seen are where the Edwards Plateau and the Blackline Prairie sort of come together with the South Texas Plains. So you have that transition zone. Found hundreds and hundreds of plants there. And we've collected seed. We're actually growing that one. And I was told that it was very difficult to grow and you'll never get any germination. And I was like, well, let's just throw it out and see what happens. And we've got like 100 plants that came up. So I don't know what they were doing wrong. So yeah, let me figure out it does those things in the wild. So it's a great plant. You can collect seeds of it. Yeah, those are really cool. There was a seed pod earlier if you didn't see that. Well, I was having a conversation with Camille earlier. Some of the time, when I have done plant, let's say, I hate the term restoration because I'm not restoring anything, but when we're trying to enhance and increase the diversity of property, and especially if you're dealing with high deer population or cattle or anything that can just come through and start eating these plants, one of the things that we do is we do these exclusion areas, and they could be, generally we're looking at about 3 meters by 3 meters, but you can make them larger if you want. And you do heavy concentrations of plantings of highly diverse in those areas. And you spread those apart like every 50 meters or so, depending on how much money you have and how much money you want to throw at something like this. These examples are coming from West Texas, where I was working with landowners that had lots of money, so we could just make tons of these things. And we put all those plants in there to where the cattle, the deer can't get to them, with the hopes of they'll go ahead and finish out their full phenology, go ahead and flower and seed out and start spreading into the areas around them and sort of connecting those over time. Now we're using shrubs and wild and herbaceous plants out there and not sort of those mott's area. To me, that it would make sense, but I heard you, did you say pines? Oh, tiny, okay, yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, I would be all for that, but again, it's what are you replacing there? Are you trying to mimic? Well, are you trying to mimic? Let's say we take the Edwards Plateau, which used to be a savanna. So it's the open grasslands, meadows mixed in with these sort of woodland mottes. And if you're trying to mimic those woodland mottes, that's great. You know, if you're trying to mimic the woodland motte plus an open sort of grassland area, I'm not sure if that's going to work. But if you were doing like one that was just woodland motte, another one that was sort of herbaceous grassland, prairie land, whatever you want to call it, I'm sure that would be fine. But over time, I mean, you have to think that they need to connect at some point, depending on the habitat, I should say. Yes. APGA, American Public Gardens Association. So with having that recognition, we need to have, there's certain things. One of those would be sort of plants with provenance, knowledge of those plants, all that sort of good stuff. Well, I'm not sure of everything that y'all are using. I will say this, it's really nice driving around neighborhoods here and seeing Cordia in full bloom. Yeah, that's a beautiful native landscape plant that even my time in like 2006, I don't remember seeing it that often or that common down here in some of these areas. Trying to think if there's, I mean, maybe not this far south, but I would highly recommend doing acorn collections from the Quercus virginianus just up the coast. If you're going to be using oak trees, you know, somebody growing that local genetics, that would be really good. No, I have one more slide actually, and this is something that has come up a lot lately, and I was going to stick it into the presentation, but I want to sort of save this for the very end. And then now I think that because social media is such a huge thing, and that ability to share information so quickly is not what it was about 10 years ago. And I've been mentioning this to lots of people about like, who uses iNaturalist? Okay, who obscures all their data? Good. Who has ever shared local obscured data with somebody that you trust? And have they shared them with anyone else? Exactly. So getting back to that cypripedium, I can absolutely tell you that there are populations of plants, roadside rare plants, that are absolutely gone now due to sharing of information. I don't know what the network is where this information is getting out, but there are cactus populations in West Texas that are completely gone. When I was working with the Asclepias, I knew about one of those populations that's out there in Starr County. And at that time, you know, when I first photographed it, there were not a lot of, actually, I think my photograph, and there was a couple of others that I was able to find online, and that was it. And then now you start looking and there's just tons and tons of photos. And so that population, that information, that location has gotten out to the public. And so that's sort of become sort of the sacrificial population. And it took me many years to finally collect seed from that population. Part of that was due to drought. Part of that was the clearing with the dozer that came through. And part of that, you could tell that somebody else was out there collecting seed. And so that sort of hampers some of the work that we're trying to do when you have people that are collecting stuff. So I know that I post things online. I try to keep most of that stuff secret. I don't post anything to iNaturalist. I do use iNaturalist though, to look for locations of plants if I'm out looking for certain things. But so it took a very long time to get to that point to where we can grow these plants out, and sort of eventually I'm hoping that we're going to be putting more of this on private land in that same area. But anyway, so be careful when you're sharing that information, those GPS coordinates, et cetera, because it really does just take one person to release it to someone else, and then those plants get collected. So anyway, so getting back to whenever I post stuff, and I try to educate people online about some of the work that we do, and oftentimes we'll have people approach us, and I'm not the only one. It's like, oh, that's great that you're growing that plant. I'd love to establish a conservation garden in my backyard. I have lots of natives. That's good. I have rare plants at my house in Alpine. If I died going home tonight, what would happen to my house? What would happen to those rare plants? Nothing. I mean, somebody might buy that house and they might just take everything out. And so that's not really a conservation garden in your back garden. And I'm not trying to take away anything from people that are growing plants in their backyard and propagating these species. That's not what I'm talking about. It's more about those folks that are sort of coveting these plants just to have them in their own personal collection. And that's not really conservation. So I think a lot of people get confused about some of that stuff. My hope is some of these rare plants that they're no longer rare, and we can get them out for those people. If you want to have that sort of botanical curiosity of Asclepias frustrata or Astrophyta mysterious or whatever it may be, growing in your own personal garden, great. I'm all for that. I love plants. I have many of those rare or unusual plants in my garden. So if you are doing seed collection or rescuing, the ideal situation is try to get that to a place that's going to be around for much longer than one human lifetime. So that'd be something like a botanic garden, or not even a human lifetime, someone's career, to where if I retire, that person behind me is going to be able to take the charge and know what to do with these plants, and we have them sort of in a safe place. Plant rescues. I work with someone in Williamson County. She's a master naturalist. She started the plant rescue project. She's doing a great job. She's contacting contractors. She's going out getting permission to collect. She's not collecting off the roadside, stuff like that. And that's when you say something like plant rescue to the public, they think, oh, so it's perfectly fine to dig these plants up on the side of the road. In the vast majority of cases, plants on the side of the road are perfectly safe. Contact TxDOT or your local chapter or whatever organization that deals with mowing or what have you to let them know where that is. Matt Buckingham, he's tracking a lot of these rare plants on roadsides. He works for TxDOT. He's working with the local contractors that go out and mow, et cetera, et cetera. It's a complicated process, but they're doing better than they did 10 or 15 years ago. I don't know if you can actually see what this is. Can you see where it is? Yeah, it's in a pile of trash. I was there this morning, and so I have a truckload of these things now because I picked them up out of the trash. One of the first plants when I was working down here in 2006, I was taken to this site over there off Alton Glore and shown this population, and these plants were on the ground, and we picked them up. I picked some up. I was so excited, like, oh my gosh, I want to take these back to the Wildflower Center. We can get them out to people. And I was kind of reprimanded because they're rare plants. And it's like, wait, so you'd rather them just go to a landfill than us pick them up and take them somewhere? And that never made sense to me. And so it's funny, I don't know how many, 15 years later or so, I'm going back to that same spot, collecting these guys off the ground out of a trash heap to get those out to various botanic gardens. I took one of these as a display species or specimen at the John Ferry Budding Out collection or festival, and had tons of people stop and ask what that plant was because it was in full bloom. Like, where can we buy that? Where can we get that? It's like, well, it's not for sale, but who knows? Maybe somebody can propagate this later on. One of the folks that I met with was from Houston Botanic Gardens. So the majority of the plants that I just collected today are going to be shipped to Houston Botanic Gardens. So that's going to be a safe place for these plants, and not necessarily someone's backyard or porch in Dallas, because they'll never survive there. So Yeah, just be careful with the information that you give out. I'm seeing more and more of that, and it's not just not liking iNaturalist or the science that's behind it or the data that's being collected. I'm actively seeing plant populations being removed completely in some areas. There are populations, there's a population of Escobaria minima, known population, 100 meters or so off the highway and outside of Marathon. And someone last year posted some photos and someone said, what were we taking photos of? And they listed this plant. And so I said, wow, who are you with? And, or how did you get access to that property? Because I've never been able to get access to that property. And the response came back as, you know, it belongs to the whatever Native American tribe, and that person didn't believe in the European law of land ownership or something. And it was essentially trespassing, but he's not trespassing to help anyone. He was just, you know, for his own personal gain of taking those photos. And so I looked on iNaturalist, and there was about 16 or so different observations of that one population. Nobody had permission to be there at all. It's trespassing. Yeah. Oh, that's my friend's garden in El Paso. They're avid cactophiles. I don't know what you call them. But they're German. Hopefully that explains it. Or he is. They have several hundred species of cacti that they've purchased over the years or seed grown, what have you. And it's kind of the show, like if something happened to them, like what would happen to that garden. And I've been involved with sort of plant rescues from avid collectors. And so it's like this mad rush, like someone passed away, the house is being sold, and we have to get people over there, just like the rescue that's going on over at Santa Margarita Ranch. You have to get all these people in there. And at that point, like, well, we don't know where these plants came from. You're just really collecting specimens. And so this is sort of like, yes, absolutely one of the most beautiful cactus gardens I've ever seen. It's privately owned. But on a sort of a botanical side for conservation, for scientific research, et cetera, it's not being used for that. So it's just to show that. And I was just there in February, I think, and they still had some things covered because of the freeze. I thought you were talking about the beer cans plants, yeah. So that was the site that we went to the other last time I was in town. So, all right, thanks everyone for coming out.